Hi, it's Dr. Sandy Queen with Queen Homeschool Supplies, and today I'm continuing my series on the Charlotte Mason approach, language arts, and the 4 different levels of language arts. This is all explained in great detail in our little book on language arts, a Charlotte Mason approach. But I want to talk about those, the second level. We talked yesterday about the first level of language arts in a Charlotte Mason style education, which is reading living books together. And today I want to talk to you about the next step, which would be narration. And narration is something that you may have heard of before. For me, it was one of those things that I heard of early on, and I thought, that just sounds kind of like not very effective, and maybe I'll give it a try and just see if it works. And I was greatly surprised. First, I just want to ask you, maybe you have heard of or seen or even used a reader comprehension program for your children, where you have like a reader of different stories, a book of different stories, and then you have a corresponding workbook that asks the child questions about what they read, kind of like what you would see on a standardized test for the reading comprehension portion. And that is something that, they have just a short little story and then some questions that the child has to answer in a specific way to show that they are comprehending what they read. And most of you probably know what I'm talking about. If you haven't used it with your own kids, if you went to school, you probably had to use it there, or you've at least seen them in what I'm talking about in the standardized test. And one question that I usually ask when I give this session all around the country is, how many raise your hand if you had a child that was their favorite thing to do for school? And everybody just kind of laughs and shakes their head. No, my kids hated that. And mine did too. We've been using the Charlotte Mason approach for over 33 years, but we did early on in our homeschool journey take a 2-week foray into textbooks just to see what it was all about. And my own experience, I had a little daughter, Kylie, my firstborn, who learned how to read before her 3rd birthday, and by the time she was 3, she could read basically anything, and she pretty much would just read constantly. I would have to force her to put a book down and go out and play like a real kid because she just wanted to sit around reading all the time. She loved reading. She enjoyed it. And she had very good comprehension because she would come and tell me all about the things that she read about. And so I thought, this is great. Let me use one of these reading comprehension programs and really get a feel for what she's comprehending. And what I noticed was that within 2 weeks, I would say that I said to Kylie, come on, Kylie, it's time for us to do school. And this is when we were using the textbooks with the reading comprehension program for those 2 weeks. She said to me one day, oh, Mom, do we have to do school today? Do we have to read? Reading's so boring. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, I broke her, right? She loved reading. It was her favorite thing to do. And suddenly, once we instituted this reading comprehension program, she began to despise reading because she knew that boring story and that awful list of questions was coming. And so that was an eye-opener for me, and I threw that stuff away, really. I didn't even want to pass it on to somebody else, and thought, let's just go back to what we had been doing, which was the Charlotte Mason approach. And so anyhow, so a lot of times people will hear that and they'll say, well, then how do I know if my child is understanding what they're reading if I don't have something like that tool? And let me just park here and talk to you about that tool. So the reading comprehension programs that you see out there are geared toward a classroom setting, when you have one teacher and a room full of students, and that teacher isn't working one-on-one or 1-on-5 or 6 or 7 or however many children that you have with each child. They're working with a classroom, and they need a tool to show them which children are understanding what they're reading and which aren't. Okay, if you have less than 30 children, you probably don't need a tool like that. What you can use instead is something very simple that Charlotte Mason called narration. And narration is a tool for you as the parent. So narration works like this, very simple. Let's say I'm reading this book with my children, Edward VI, England's Valiant Boy King, from our Living History Readers series at queenhomeschool.com. Wonderful book that's the story of England's boy king from his early childhood through his older years. And let's say we're reading this as a read aloud with my children, using it because it's a living book, like I talked about in my last video. And then, we're having a good old time just reading a chapter a day after we're done with our other schoolwork. We usually would pile on my bed or on the couch or whatever, and I would read to all the kids. And then, of course, Dad is at work. And so we read this interesting chapter of this story of what's going on in Edward VI's life, what we're learning about that particular day. And then that's it. And then at dinner that night, I want to involve Dad, who's home from work. And I say to one of my kids, I turn to my son and say, "Hey, Luke, remember that story that we read about Edward VI when he was a boy and that interesting thing that he did? Remember how funny that was?" And Luke looks at me kind of like with that deer in the headlights look in his eyes like, "What are you talking about, Mom?" But then he has to think and process through what we read about. And I'll say to him, "Tell Dad your favorite part about that story." And so now Luke's thinking about what we read, and now he has to process it and come back out with it in his own words and share it with Dad, who enjoys it just as much hearing it from Luke. And so as they're laughing and conversing over this chapter that we had read when Dad was at work, I'm sitting there as the homeschool mom thinking, okay, he understood what we read about well enough to explain it to someone else. That is the very simple act of narration. And do you see how it does the same thing? Actually, much more so, because it really forces the child to think through and come back out with something in their own words. And that is a tool for the homeschooling parent to gauge whether or not your child is understanding what they're reading or what's being read to them. So all that said, narration, again, is a tool for you as a parent. It's something that's in your toolbox. If I have a toolbox, which I do, I'm going to have a hammer, I'm going to have some screwdrivers, I'm going to have different tools in that toolbox. And I'm not going to take that hammer out and use it if I need a screwdriver. I'm going to take the hammer out only when I need to use a hammer, right? And so are you. And that's kind of what narration is. It's a tool that you take out when you need to use it, not constantly every time you need any tool. And this is where I've seen some different curriculums that are out there. I'm not going to name any of them that have maybe where you read a portion and then they have something like a break for narration, and every day you're doing narration, or maybe several times throughout the reading. And that's not really what Charlotte Mason recommended as far as how to use narration. Narration is, again, it's a tool. You're not going to use it constantly. You're not going to use a hammer constantly. You're going to use it as a tool when you need to know something. And so, let's say you have a child that's just learning to read and they're just starting to read independently, and you want to see, are they getting it? Are they understanding? And then I would do narration with that child and ask them something simple like, what was your favorite part of that story or that book that you read today? Or what did you find most interesting? Or what was the funny part? Or something like that. Just to kind of give them a starting point for what to think of, what you expect to hear back. Let's say, I get a good handle on, okay, this child is understanding, they have good comprehension. That's fine. I'm going to leave them read every day, and I'm not going to make them do narration every day because I know that child has good comprehension. I've done narration a couple days in a row, and I don't want to bog them down and make them hate reading by knowing that they're going to have to answer questions or tell me about it every single day when they read something, or multiple times per day, as some of these curriculums are doing, inserting these breaks. And so then maybe I'm reading something to the child, or maybe I'm giving the child a book that I know is not a subject he really is interested in, but I want him to read it anyhow. Or maybe I'm giving him a book that's harder than he's used to reading, or I'm reading a book to him that's more challenging for him to listen to with higher level vocabulary. And I want to make sure that they're getting it. So again, I'm going to bring out that tool from my toolbox, narration, and I'm going to have the child do narration on those occasions so that I can make sure that they are understanding this higher level of listening or reading, or this more challenging because it's not something that is of natural interest to them. And that, again, is when I would bring out that tool of narration to use once again. So I hope you can see the difference between something that's a forced narration regularly, that's very much like that comprehension program that can turn a child off to reading very easily because it's not really something that's necessary when you're homeschooling, and this very natural way to use narration, which is as a tool in your homeschool parent toolbox.